In the spring of 2011, in the town of Harmony Creek, population 812, Elara Vance was denied a loan for $3,000. That denial, a single keystroke in a system of 1 million keystrokes, would ultimately force the Heartland National Bank to write off a loss of $1.4 million. This is not a story about finance. It is a story about accounting. Let me tell you about Harmony Creek. It sits in a shallow valley carved by a river that shares its name, a place where the prairie finally gives up and lets the rolling hills begin. It was founded in 1874 by settlers who believed in two things: a deep Lutheran God and the unassailable logic of a 160-acre section. For 100 years, that logic held. The town had a grain elevator, a rail spur, 3 churches, a school, and a general store run by the Vance family. By 2011, the rail spur was a bike path, the grain elevator was a silent monument, and only one church held services on Sunday. The school had been consolidated with the counties in 1988. But the general store, Vance Mercantile, was still there. And so was Elara Vance. Elara was 78 years old. She had been born in the apartment above the store, had taken her first steps on its oiled floorboards, and had worked behind its long oak counter for 62 of her years. She inherited the store not by law, but by practice, when her father, Abel, suffered a stroke in 1971 while stacking 50-pound sacks of flour. He lived another decade, sitting in a chair by the pot-bellied stove, watching his daughter run the numbers and extend the credit, and he had nodded his approval. The store was her life, but it was also the town's memory. On its shelves you could find not only bread and milk, but also fan belts for a 1978 John Deere tractor, glass fuses for houses built before 1950, and jars of pickled beets canned by a woman who had died 3 years prior but had made a surplus. The store's net profit in 2010 was $8,750. This was a fact. Elara Vance was a widow. Her husband Thomas had been killed in Korea in 1952, a month before their first anniversary. She never remarried. Her life was a thing of quiet, disciplined ritual. She rose at 5 a.m., opened the store at 7 a.m., and closed it at 6 p.m., 6 days a week. She was known for her unyielding posture and for a habit of looking at a person's hands when they spoke, as if their true intentions were written on their knuckles. Her father had taught her that. People talk with their mouths, he'd said, but they confess with their hands. The man who would deny her the loan was named Daniel Harrison. He was 34 years old, had been the branch manager of the Harmony Creek Heartland National Bank for 7 months, and was known for the energetic, almost frantic way he tapped his chrome ballpoint pen on his glass desktop. He had an MBA from the University of Illinois and a profound faith in the objective power of data. He had been sent from a regional office in Peoria with a clear mandate: bring the Harmony Creek branch into the 21st century. This meant migrating all accounts to the new online platform, minimizing discretionary lending, and cleaning up the portfolio of non-performing assets left by his predecessor, a man named Frank Miller, who had known every customer by their father's name and had approved loans based on what he called character collateral. Frank Miller had been forced into early retirement after the 2008 financial crisis exposed the profound systemic risk of such a philosophy. Harrison saw Miller not as a community banker, but as a liability. He saw the town's web of handshakes and mutual favors not as social cohesion, but as an undocumented risk pool. Let me tell you about the loan. It was for $3,000. The Harmony Creek Historical Society needed to repair the roof of its building, which was the town's original one-room schoolhouse built in 1881. Elara was the society's treasurer. A state inspector had issued a citation. The roof had to be replaced by July 1st, or the building would be condemned. The society had $1,247 in its account. A bake sale had raised another $412. They were short by roughly $3,000, accounting for a small contingency. The contractor, a man named Bill Jacobson, whose grandfather had helped build the schoolhouse, had offered to do the work at cost for $4,600. Elara had approached the bank not as a supplicant, but as a partner in the preservation of a shared asset. This was her first mistake. To Daniel Harrison, the schoolhouse was not an asset. It was a 130-year-old wooden structure with a depreciated value of zero. The meeting took place on a Tuesday in April. The air in the bank was chilled to a precise 68 degrees and smelled of industrial carpet cleaner. It was a stark contrast to Elara's store, which smelled of sawdust, coffee, and old paper. She sat across the wide, sterile desk from Mr. Harrison. She had not dressed up. She wore her usual grey cardigan, darned at the elbows, and the simple cotton dress. She placed her worn leather handbag on her lap. She did not touch the plastic bottle of water he offered her. Harrison smiled a practiced, efficient smile. He had already run her numbers. He swiveled his monitor so she could see the screen, a gesture of transparency he had been taught in a corporate training seminar. Mrs. Vance, he began, his pen starting its rhythmic tap, tap, tap. We appreciate you coming to us. Heartland National is committed to supporting local communities. He pointed to a column of figures. As you can see, I have your financials here. Your personal income consists of $1,142 a month in Social Security benefits. The store's net income last year, according to your tax filings, was $8,750. That gives you a total annual income of just over $22,000. He paused, letting the numbers settle in the cool air. Your credit score is 640. That's considered fair. But for an unsecured loan, our underwriting guidelines require a minimum of 680. You have no outstanding debts, which is excellent. Commendable, really. But you also have very little in the way of verifiable assets to offer as collateral. The store building itself, the county assessor values it at $25,000, but the land is zoned commercial historic, which significantly complicates a potential sale. Elara watched his hands. The pen was a blur of nervous energy. He was not a cruel man. He was a frightened man, afraid of violating the rules that gave his world meaning. She spoke for the first time. Her voice was low and steady. It was not the voice of a woman asking for a favour. It was the voice of a woman stating a fact. The store's books don't tell the whole story, Mr. Harrison. He stopped tapping. I'm afraid they're the only story the bank is authorised to read. We have to operate on verifiable data, income, assets, credit history. It's the only way to be fair to everyone. Fairness is not the same as equality, Elara said, a phrase her father had used often. The books show what's paid in cash. They don't show the credit I extend to the farmers in the spring to be paid at harvest. They don't show the barter when Mrs. Gable pays for her groceries in eggs and Mr. Henderson fixes my plumbing in exchange for a new set of work gloves. Last year, that was worth another $10,000 at least. It's not on the tax forms because it's not money, but it's value. Harrison's smile tightened. Mrs. Vance, I understand that in a small town there are informal economies at play, but that's anecdotal. It's not data. I can't put eggs from Mrs. Gable into a loan application. The system wouldn't know what to do with it. The system is the problem then, she said, not as an accusation, but as a diagnosis, not the eggs. He sighed, a gust of professional sympathy. He swiveled the monitor back. I'm sorry, I truly am. But a $3,000 unsecured loan, at your income level and with your credit profile, the algorithm simply won't approve it. My hands are tied. He looked at his own hands as if to confirm this. Elara stood up. The meeting had taken less than 10 minutes. She looked at the young man, at his crisp shirt and his earnest, data-driven certainty. She felt a pang of something that was not anger, but a deep, weary sorrow. He was a man who could read a spreadsheet, but not a town. He could calculate risk, but not worth. "You are mistaken, Mr. Harrison," she said quietly. "Your hands are not tied. You have simply chosen to bind them with the wrong rope." She turned and walked out of the bank, the automatic glass doors hissing shut behind her. She did not look back. Let me tell you about the ledgers. There were two of them. They were kept under the counter at Vance Mercantile, inside a small, fire-resistant safe that had been installed in 1922. The first was the official business ledger. It was a standard green accounting book, its columns filled with Elara's neat, precise script. It recorded every sale, every expense, every transaction that involved United States currency. This was the ledger she showed the taxman. This was the ledger Daniel Harrison had based his decision on. It was a book of facts. The second ledger was older, larger, and bound in worn, cracked calfskin. The cover was blank. Its pages were not crisp paper, but thick, creamy linen stock, yellowed with age. It had been purchased by her grandfather, Silas Vance, in 1888. The first entry was dated May 12, 1888. Credit to John Miller, 2 bags seed corn, 1 sack flour, to be paid at harvest. There was no dollar amount listed. Silas Vance had not been recording a debt. He had been recording a promise. Her father, Abel, had continued the tradition. Through the Great Depression, through the war years, through the fat years of the 50s and the lean years of the 70s, he had maintained the second ledger. He recorded debts, yes, but he also recorded other things. He recorded favours. He recorded acts of charity. He recorded handshake agreements over property lines and water rights. He recorded when one family helped another raise a barn, or bring in a harvest when a father was sick, or looked after children when a mother passed. He called it the Book of Balances. It was not an accounting of money, it was an accounting of community. Elara had not made an entry in it for over 20 years. She had come to believe, sadly, that the world it represented was gone, that the age of Daniel Harrison and his algorithms had finally, irrevocably arrived. She was about to be proven wrong. The news of the loan denial spread through Harmony Creek the way all news did, a quiet chain of conversations over coffee at the diner, across fence posts and in the pews after church. It was met not with outrage, but with a kind of resigned sadness. It was another sign that the town was becoming a ghost of itself, a place where the rules were made by people who had never set foot there. People who believed a town was a collection of assets and liabilities, and not a collection of souls. The condemnation notice for the schoolhouse was posted on the door on May 1st. The roof had to be replaced by July 1st. Time was running out. It was then that the second story began to unfold, the one that had been building silently in the background for 3 years. It concerned the old Miller farm. Let me tell you about the Miller farm. It was 160 acres of the best bottomland in the county, bordering the creek for half a mile. It had been in the Miller family since 1874. The John Miller in Silas Vance's ledger had been the first. His great-grandson, Tom Miller, had been the last. Tom was a good farmer, but a bad businessman. In 2007, encouraged by rising commodity prices and the easy credit being pushed by Frank Miller, the bank manager at the time, Tom had taken out a massive loan of $1.4 million. He used the farm as collateral. He wasn't expanding his farm, he was partnering with an out-of-state developer to build a 40-home subdivision called Creekwood Estates. It was a dream of turning black dirt into suburban gold. The dream died in the fall of 2008. The housing market collapsed. The developer declared bankruptcy. Tom Miller was left holding a $1.4 million note on a farm that generated, in a good year, a net income of $50,000. He struggled for 2 years, selling off equipment, taking a second job driving a truck. In 2010, he gave up. He signed a deed in lieu of foreclosure and walked away from the land that had defined his family for 136 years. He and his family moved to Texas. The Miller farm was now an asset on the books of Heartland National Bank. A non-performing asset. A toxic asset. When Daniel Harrison arrived, his primary directive from corporate was to unload it, get it off the books before the end of the second quarter. He cleaned up the title, paid the back taxes, and scheduled a public auction. The date was set for June 15th. The minimum bid was $250,000, the outstanding value of the original agricultural loan before the development deal. Harrison was confident. He had a serious expression of interest from a corporate agricultural fund based in Chicago. They specialized in buying distressed farmland, consolidating it into larger holdings, and leasing it back to tenant farmers. They were efficient. They were data-driven. They were, in Harrison's view, the future of farming. Their local representative would be at the auction. For Harrison, the sale would be a major victory, a significant step in cleaning up the branch's messy, relationship-based past and aligning it with a clean, profitable, data-based future. Elara Vance watched all of this unfold. She knew Tom Miller. She knew his father and his grandfather. She remembered the day Tom's son was born. She also knew the land. She had picnicked on the banks of Harmony Creek on that property as a girl. She knew the old oak tree that marked the southern boundary and the patch of wild asparagus that grew near the abandoned well house. And she knew what the second ledger, her father's book of balances, had to say about that land. The week before the auction, she did something she hadn't done in years. She took the old calfskin ledger from the safe. She opened it on the long oak counter of the store, the pages falling open to sections marked with her father's familiar hand. The Miller farm. Her father had a system. He didn't use page numbers. He used family names and landmarks. She spent 3 evenings tracing the history of that 160-acre plot, not as it was written at the county courthouse, but as it was written in the life of the town. She read about the spring of 1934, the height of the Dust Bowl. The creek had run dry. John Miller's son, George, had a deep well that still drew water. The ledger noted, George Miller provides water for the herds of Henry Gable, Samuel Finch, and Peter Larson. No charge taken. Balance held by their sons. She read an entry from 1948. A fire had started in the Millers' barn. Men from a dozen surrounding farms had come, forming a bucket brigade from the creek, and saved the farmhouse. The ledger listed every man's name. Underneath, her father had written, The Miller house stands on land owned by all. She found an entry from 1961. The county wanted to widen the road and needed to claim a 5-foot strip of the Millers' land along the northern edge. But doing so would have required tearing down a line of ancient maple trees planted by the first Mrs. Miller. A verbal agreement was made at a town meeting, witnessed by 24 people, including her father. The Miller family would gift the county a different 10-foot strip of less valuable land on the far side of the property in exchange for the permanent preservation of the maple trees. No deed was ever updated, but the road was moved. The trees still stood. The ledger recorded the promise. There were more, dozens more. A right-of-way granted to the church in 1925 for their annual picnic. A promise of hunting rights to the descendants of the Henderson family, made in 1902 after Silas Henderson helped the Millers fight a legal claim from the railroad. A handshake deal from 1955 allowing the town to draw water from the creek on Miller land in perpetuity in case of drought. None of these agreements were filed with the county recorder. They were not legal encumbrances. They were not liens or easements in the eyes of the state. On paper, the title held by Heartland National Bank was clean, but the land was not. The land was saturated with a century of promises. It was encumbered by the weight of memory. The day of the auction, June 15th, was hot and still. The air was thick with the smell of new-mown hay and diesel fumes. The auction was held on the steps of the county courthouse, a squat brick building from the 1950s. A crowd of about 50 people had gathered. Most were from Harmony Creek. They were not there to bid. They were there to watch, to bear witness. Daniel Harrison was there, standing to one side, looking crisp and confident in a dark suit, despite the heat. He nodded to the man from the Chicago Agricultural Fund, a man in a polo shirt and expensive loafers who looked profoundly out of place. The young teller from the bank, Sarah, was there too, sent to handle the paperwork. She stood nervously behind her boss. The auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and a practiced rhythm, read the legal description of the property. He announced the minimum bid of $250,000. He asked for an opening offer. A man from Chicago raised his hand almost lazily. $250,000, he said, his voice flat. I have $250, the auctioneer boomed. Do I hear $260? $260 anywhere? He scanned the crowd of silent, watching faces. The farmers in their seed caps, the women in their summer dresses. Their faces were impassive. $250,000 going once? This was the moment Harrison had been waiting for, the clean disposal of a toxic asset, a victory for the algorithm. Going twice. It was then that Elara Vance stepped forward. She had been standing at the back of the crowd. She moved slowly with the deliberate grace of the old. In her hands she carried the old calfskin ledger. She didn't walk to the auctioneer, she walked to the man from Chicago. The crowd parted for her. She stopped in front of him. He looked down at her, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. Daniel Harrison took a step forward, ready to intervene. Before you buy this land, Elara said, her voice not loud, but carrying in the sudden silence, you should know what else you are buying. She opened the ledger. The thick, yellowed pages lay flat in her hands. This book was started by my grandfather in 1888. It's a record of the town's accounts, not in dollars, but in promises. Harrison spoke, his voice tight. Mrs. Vance, this is a legal proceeding. Whatever you have there is not relevant. Elara ignored him. She looked at the man from Chicago. In 1934, she began, reading from the page, the owner of this land, George Miller, gave free access to his well to the Gable, Finch, and Larson families during the drought. The ledger says, balance held by their sons. The grandsons of those men are here today. Mr. Gable, she nodded to a man in the crowd who touched the brim of his hat. Mr. Finch, Mr. Larson. Two other men nodded. They believe they have a claim to water from that land. Will you honor it? The man from Chicago frowned. His lawyer, who had been standing behind him, stepped forward and began whispering in his ear. Elara turned a page. In 1961, the Miller family made a public promise to the town, witnessed by my father and 20 other men. They agreed to preserve the line of maple trees along the North Road. The county, in turn, accepted a different parcel for the road. That promise is not on your title search, but there are 3 men standing here who were at that meeting. They believe that promise is binding. Will you honor it? She continued. She spoke of the church's right-of-way for its picnic, a tradition that had lapsed but was not forgotten. She spoke of the Henderson family's hunting rights, passed down through 4 generations. She spoke of the town's right to draw water from the creek in an emergency. With each claim, she would name the families involved, and in the quiet crowd, a man or a woman would nod, their presence a silent testimony. These were not legal claims, they were moral claims. They were strands in a web of obligation and memory that was invisible to a title search, but was as real as the land itself. The man from Chicago was no longer looking at the auctioneer. He was looking at the crowd, at the silent, watching faces, He was a man of spreadsheets and contracts. He was seeing for the first time a form of collateral he could not quantify, a risk he could not hedge. His lawyer was whispering furiously now, words like litigation, nuisance claims, clouded title, and community opposition could be heard. The clean, simple asset of 160 acres was becoming a complex, messy, and potentially expensive problem. The man who had come to buy a farm was realizing he would be purchasing a hornet's nest of ancestral grievances. He looked at Harrison, then at Elara and the book in her hands. He shook his head slightly. He took a step back and spoke to the auctioneer. "I withdraw my bid." A quiet gasp went through the crowd. Daniel Harrison's face went pale. He looked as if the solid ground beneath his feet had turned to sand. The auctioneer, flustered, tried to recover. "The bid is withdrawn. We are back at an opening bid of $250,000. Do I have $250?" He looked out at the crowd, at the farmers, the shopkeepers, the church ladies of Harmony Creek. They stared back at him, their arms crossed. Their silence was a wall. "Do I have a bid? Any bid at all?" No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the buzz of cicadas in the maple trees Elara had spoken of. The auctioneer looked at Harrison, who gave a slight, defeated shake of his head. No one else made a bid. The aftermath was quiet and devastatingly simple. Heartland National Bank was now the permanent owner of 160 acres of prime farmland that it could not sell. Harrison tried to find another buyer. He called other corporate farms. But the story of the Harmony Creek auction had spread. The land was now known to be troubled. No one wanted to get into a protracted, multi-front war with the town that kept its records in a 100-year-old ledger. The asset was now a permanent liability. A month later, a letter arrived at the bank. It was from the newly formed Harmony Creek Community Land Trust. Elara Vance was the chairperson. The letter offered to buy the 160-acre Miller farm. The offer was not for $250,000. It was for $20,000 to be paid in installments of $2,000 a year for 10 years at 0% interest. Harrison wanted to laugh. It was an insulting, ridiculous offer. It was less than the back taxes he had already paid. But his regional manager in Peoria did not laugh. He saw the cold logic. The trust's offer was the only one they had. It was the only one they were ever likely to get. Holding the land meant paying taxes on it every year, incurring liability, and showing a non-performing asset on the books indefinitely. The $20,000 was a pittance, but it was more than zero. It allowed them to finally close the books on the disastrous Creekwood Estates loan. In August, Harrison signed the papers. The bank officially took a loss of $1,380,000 on the loan, plus several years of carrying costs and legal fees. The total write-off was closer to $1.5 million, all for a piece of land that an old woman had redefined with a book of stories. The town raised the $2,000 for the first payment in a single weekend with a town-wide potluck dinner on the newly acquired land. They used the proceeds to also pay Bill Jacobson to finally fix the roof on the Historical Society's building. Elara Vance never did get her $3,000 loan. She didn't need it. Daniel Harrison was transferred the following spring to a branch in a featureless Chicago suburb. His fast-track career had been permanently derailed. He had not made a mistake in his calculations. He had made a mistake in his assumptions. He had assumed that the only things that have value are the things that can be counted. Sarah, the young teller, quit the bank 2 months after the auction. She became the first paid employee of the Harmony Creek Community Land Trust, its bookkeeper. She did not use a computer. She used a simple green accounting ledger, and she started asking Elara Vance to teach her about the town's other set of books. The Miller farm was never developed. It was divided into 10-acre plots, leased at affordable rates to young families who wanted to farm. It became a place of community gardens, of starter farms for organic vegetables and free-range chickens. It became once again a source of life for the town, not a source of debt. Elara Vance passed away peacefully in her sleep 5 years after the auction, at the age of 83. She died in the same apartment above the store where she had been born. She left the store to Sarah. She left the 2 ledgers to the Historical Society. They were put in a glass case, side by side. One was labelled a book of facts, the other was labelled a book of truths. There are 2 ways to keep accounts. One is the way of the banks, a system of numbers that measures profit and loss, assets and liabilities. It is a language of sterile, objective facts, a world of black and red ink. It is a useful and necessary system, but it is incomplete. There is another way, the way of the old calfskin ledger. It is a system that accounts for things that have no price. It measures promises kept, favours returned, and kindnesses rendered. It tracks the debts of one generation to the next. It records the invisible, unbreakable threads of trust and memory that bind a people together. Its currency is not the dollar. Its currency is character. A modern bank can no longer read this second ledger. It is a language they have forgotten, but they ignore it at their peril. Because a community's real wealth is not stored in a vault. It is stored in its stories. And sometimes one of those stories is powerful enough to save a town, or in this case, to cost a bank $1.4 million over a loan for $3,000. It all depends on which ledger you believe is telling the truth.